Hey all, Ron here from Military Images with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to Warsaw, Indiana. It's about a day's ride on horseback from Fort Wayne, just a few days after the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861. Townspeople in Warsaw rallied to form an infantry company in the wake of war, the start of war, and the first man to enlist in this new company is pictured here. His name is Andy Millis. He was a local bookseller, had a shock of curly hair. He was as patriotic as they come and ready to whip rebels. The company was quickly formed, and the recruits voted for officers, which is a common practice in the volunteer army. They elected a captain, a first lieutenant, and a second lieutenant, as any company would have. They also made a slightly unusual move in that they elected a third lieutenant, also known as an ensign. Not always done, not common, but they did, and they elected Milice as the third lieutenant. Unfortunately for Millis, third lieutenants were so odd, they're rarely needed, and so it wasn't really a good fit. But that was his rank. The Warsaw Company became part of the 12th Indiana Infantry. As the leadership of the regiment couldn't quite figure out and had no provision for a third lieutenant, company commanders took away his shoulder straps and bumped him to the rank of fourth sergeant. Soon after that unceremonious downgrading, changes in the senior leadership of the regiment resulted in a vacancy for second lieutenant of Millis's company. The rank and file, again voting for their choice for officer, had two people to choose from. Milice was one of the ones on the ballot. The other was the most popular private in the company, a man named Jim McGuire. He was an older man, a Mexican war veteran, dogged by alcoholism. He was a first sergeant in the company, but the hard drinking had cost him his stripes and he got bumped down to private. But those personal issues didn't seem to matter to his comrades. They still wanted him to be elected as their new lieutenant. And in fact, a good majority of the rank and file did, in fact, elect McGuire over Milice. But a little underhanded work by the commanders of the regiment set aside the vote and gave the lieutenancy to Milice. This caused considerable dissatisfaction as the choice of the company was clear and the determination on certain persons to disregard the wishes in regard to promotions caused a lot of problems. Those who overturned the election of McGuire in favor of Milice may have thought that Milice deserved a second chance as an officer, or that McGuire's alcoholism might play a role when the company was in battle, a bad role. Whatever the reason, the reversal broke McGuire's spirit, and the unhappy men in the ranks directed their anger towards Milice. Meanwhile, the regiment had moved east, where, an unlikely source, the Confederate Army provided Milice an opportunity to stem the tide of resentment that was building against him from the men in his own company. On December 11th, 1861, a squad from Millis's company fell into enemy hands while they were on patrol along the Potomac River on the Maryland-Virginia border. One of the captured soldiers in that group was the company captain, a man named Reuben Williams. He was a peacetime newspaper editor, and he was widely respected by everyone in the company. Captain Williams is marched off as a prisoner of war to Richmond, Virginia. Company command devolved to the first lieutenant, a man reportedly disliked. Everyone disliked him. His name was Andrew Gallagher. And Milice, who was still carrying the stigma of the voided election, to McGuire becomes bumped up to the new first lieutenant. The men sort of had to now choose between a man that they despised, the new captain, Gallagher, or Millis, who they didn't really care for, but they hesitantly gave their allegiance to Milice, who they considered to be the lesser of two evils. But again, Milice had his chance and he failed to gain their trust. According to a company historian, quote, Milice had a style about him that repelled rather than won and yielded a reluctant obedience to his orders. 3 months passed. Now we're into 1862, and Captain Williams was finally released from prison and returned to his command. Milice was bumped back down the chain of command and passed the remaining 2 months of enlistment as more or less a persona non grata. Dejected, Milice mustered out of the regiment at the end of his 1-year enlistment and returned to Warsaw. Meanwhile, in that spring and summer of 1862, the Union Army was wearing thin, worn down by death, by disease, and the need to occupy extensive tracts of rebel territory. They were really getting spread a little too thin. And to make matters worse, the Army's other 1-year enlistments, all those other regiments that enlisted for 1 year were beginning to expire, sending thousands of men in the Union Army home. The Army was rapidly depleting. In response, President Abraham Lincoln issued an executive order calling for 150,000 volunteers to reinforce the ranks. In communities across the loyal states, civic and business leaders, aided by up-and-coming young patriots, rallied the citizenry with great hoopla. Milice saw an opportunity, a second chance, or maybe even a third chance, depending upon how you want to count it, to rebuild his somewhat tarnished reputation. As soon as he heard Lincoln's call, he jumped into action, helping to raise recruits for a new company that became part of a new regiment, the 74th Indiana Infantry. This time, the men elected him second lieutenant. The company historian that I gave you the quote earlier mentioned this. He said, quote, with the experience he had gained in the 12th, Milice became a very efficient officer and was quite popular with his men. Milice went on to make captain and company commander on August 21st, 1862. The memory of his failures receded into the shadows of history, and Milice went on to become a capable combat leader. He was perhaps at his finest at the Battle of Chickamauga on September 19th, 1863, about a year after he became captain. The 74th went into that engagement 376 muskets strong, plus Milice and the cadre of officers, rounding out the number to an even 400 men. Throughout the morning of September 19th, the men blasted away at rebels until their 60 rounds of ammunition apiece had been fully expended. They refilled their cartridge boxes and formed a line of battle with soldiers from 2 other regiments in the afternoon. About 2 p.m., that thin blue line advanced through a dense wood, engaged the enemy, and drove them back more than half a mile. At this critical moment, Confederate reinforcements arrived on the scene, and chaos descended as they counterattacked, pounding the Federals with infantry and artillery fire. The colonel of the 74th, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Myron Baker, said this, quote, being overpowered after a desperate struggle for the mastery of the ground, I ordered the regiment to fall back and took position on a ridge about 300 yards in rear of where our advance was checked. More than a third of the men in the company were killed or wounded, including Milice. During the thick of that fight, a bullet ripped into and tore into his shoulder, his left shoulder. The soft lead of that bullet flattened as it tore through the tissue and muscles of that left shoulder, exiting his back and leaving a gaping wound. Millis was transported to a makeshift field hospital. Surgeons probed and prodded the wound. Fortunately for Millis, they found nothing broken, no broken bones, and they ordered him evacuated to a hospital in Union-occupied Nashville to convalesce. There he came down with hepatitis and other symptoms that suggested typhoid. His condition rapidly deteriorated. Medical personnel examined him, kept an eye on his condition, and believed his case fatal. And they decided to send him home to Warsaw, where they expected he would die. Milice survived the trip home and somehow miraculously recovered, though that left arm was never quite the same. He resigned his commission a few days before Christmas of 1863. He married in 1864 and raised a family that grew to include 2 boys and a girl. After the death of his wife in 1879, he remarried, relocated to Riverside, California, and started an orange grove. He died on September 21st, 1919, just 2 days after the 56th anniversary of his wounding at the Battle of Chickamauga. He was 80 years old. There's a quote that appeared in the local newspaper, the Riverside Daily Press, that I think is a nice way to close this video. Quote, Captain Millis served his country well during the War of the 60s, a gallant record of meritorious service to his country is the legacy of Captain Millis to his children, end quote. I'll also add that that gallant record of meritorious service to the country is also our legacy. And it's also proof that Millis, though he got off to a bad start in the war, his grit and his determination helped him to power through and turn his weaknesses into strengths. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.